9 U.S. Presidents Assassinated by the Globalists by Larry Engel. And hello neighbor, I am Larry Engel. This is article number 22 about the 14th President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, and a horrific attack upon the first family that was designed to undermine and sabotage the presidency and the nation. This series of videos now claims that more than 20 U.S. presidents and other leaders were assassinated or compromised by the same people for the same reason. The reason is to conquer the nation by taking over and controlling the nation's credit. The killers are European banking dynasties, a monopoly, who call themselves Jews, but actually have a history of using secret societies, a religious worship or belief in Lucifer, and not the worship of God. Instead, these people worship money and credit. These people don't seem to worship the Old Testament. They have rejected the Old Testament. They do not follow the Ten Commandments. And the famous Jewish prophets, such as Isaiah and Elijah and Elisha and Jeremiah and so on, they claim that these people are very sinful. This aggression does not seem to me to be hard to understand, but it is so far removed from the working man's daily experience with money that it is almost impossible to believe. It is as if they sneak off with your nation's credit card, buy millions of dollars worth of corporations like mass media, military, education, natural resources, Republican Party, Democratic Party, and so on. The people of the USA get the bill. That's called the national debt. However, the monthly statement, like your credit card at home, does not reveal to us who are paying the bill what was bought with the loans or who ends up with the swag. Corporate executives under their control enjoy low payment loans that have a balloon payment. These executives are so deeply compartmentalized that they may have no idea of the harm they cause, nor who they serve, but know only that if they do not obey, that is to be politically correct, the balloon payment loan will not be approved by the bank gangsters, and they will then be broke, crushed, and instantly lose everything. Unseen bank gangsters control many famous corporations.
Rothschild brothers of London 1863 said this about taking over a nation's credit, quote, "The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from the class."
So what does the Rothschild brothers tell us here in 1863? They say that few people understand their banking system. In 700 AD, they learned to conquer nations by taking over that nation's credit. But they say few people in the nation, even the leaders, would understand this. I find that's true because I've contacted state representatives and federal representatives. They don't understand what's going on. And what he also says is that there would be so many that are dependent on his money financing, in other words, the way they take over the credit of the nation and then put the bill on us, and then use the loans to buy up our representatives and representatives or executives in corporations, the way they do that, then a few would object or give opposition to this takeover by the robber barons because they benefit from it. This is very important. So it's something that's very difficult to understand. Well, I say it's not difficult to understand. I say it's easy to understand, but it's really hard to believe that these guys get money just by typing it into a computer. So this is something that one should study. And Rothschild says here, few understand.
Banking was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits, and with a flick of the pen they will create enough deposits to buy it back again. However, take it away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear, and they ought to disappear, for it would be a happier and better world to live in. But, if you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create deposits. This was said by Sir Josiah Stamp, President of the Bank of England in the 1920s. He was the second richest man in Britain.
Now here's Sir Joseph Stamp, head of the Bank of England. He's the president of the Bank of England. He's telling us that if you were to take away all their money, just take it away and redistribute the money somewhere else, that with a flick of a pen, because they know a trick, they can get it all back. The trick is to control the volume of money in a nation. That's the trick. And so, if that's that easy with the flick of a pen, well, they have to kill the 20 presidents of the United States that I'm claiming they killed, and the other leaders, because it only takes a flick of the pen to take away their power. So this is very important. But he also says in this quote that the world would be a heck of a lot better place if, as I have recommended in my amendment, that the volume of money of a nation should be controlled by the people of the nation through their elected representatives. That's what the Lincoln Amendment is about. Now, he says something else important here that you should observe very, very carefully. He says that we, by allowing the bankers to control the monetary system, the robber barons, the Jews they call themselves, by allowing them to operate our monetary system, we pay for our own slavery. And guess what? You pay for it yourself. They don't have to pay to make you a slave. They take over your money. They spend it for themselves as loans and then tack it right on to the national debt. And so you get the bill.
John Maynard Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics, which the USA now endures, in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, written in 1920, had this to say about the banking scam, quote, "By this means government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." Repeat, quote, "Not one man in a million will detect the theft," end quote.
So we can see here that President Kennedy used the stroke of the pen to control the volume of money in circulation. He began to issue silver certificates through the Treasury that were debt-free. They didn't contribute to the national debt because it wasn't borrowed from the banks. This was a very, very important thing President Kennedy did, but it made him a target for these robber barons. In all, President Kennedy brought nearly $4.3 billion in U.S. silver certificates into circulation. This was debt-free money. It wasn't something that went on the national debt. It was created free. It wasn't borrowed. The ramifications of this action are enormous. Your country could be without a national debt. That's what it's really showing. If instead of borrowing our own money, we just simply went through the procedures necessary to create it. With a stroke of a pen, Mr. Kennedy was on his way to putting the Federal Reserve Bank out of business and restoring the nation's credit to its people. During the period of the Franklin Pierce presidency, the bank gangsters were working hard to divide the USA into two and to bring about a war using the issue of slavery. Convincing and high-sounding moral statements against putting human beings in chains and taking away blacks' freedom put the entire society and people of the southern states in very grave peril. This is true because no provision was made for the thousands of blacks who would, in a flash, be turned loose upon the towns and the cities without any source of housing, food, jobs, money, or medical care for them. National Geographic magazine reported that only 3 out of 1,000 people in the South owned slaves. To me, that means that 997 people out of every 1,000 persons had no personal interest in holding slaves, even in the South. But they would be in danger themselves if large numbers of blacks were to suddenly run amok. To impose the European-financed Confederate government upon the southern states of our nation and divide the nation, the bank gangsters required a weakened presidency. From 1848 until 1913, these banks had lost control of the nation's credit because of a system put in place by Presidents Jackson, President Polk, and President Lincoln. And these bank gangsters wanted it back. So what about Pierce? So now we must ask ourselves, was the first family intentionally attacked and compromised? Or was it just a freak accident on a railroad that killed their youngster and nearly killed them? The young presidential couple had 3 children, but 2 of them had died in infancy. So their 11-year-old, very charming Benjamin Benny Franklin was a deeply loved treasure of the President and the First Lady. The U.S. government was to be weakened and the couple devastated and ravaged by the murder of their son. The works of numerous historians who rate the Franklin presidency appear to attest to its powerlessness of physical and mental strength. The death of this little boy was devastating and tragic. Is the timing of this little boy's murder evidence it was not an accident? The boy was killed after Pierce was elected and 1 month before his inauguration. Now, President James Buchanan, who was to be the next president following Pierce, was poisoned at his inauguration party. Then 30 people died, including President Buchanan's relatives, and 200 more were made ill. The timing of the assassinations will expose the motive to those who carefully observe. A deathbed confession states Skull and Bones poisoned Buchanan, and this president was compromised. So keep in mind the timing of the JFK assassination. He was on the campaign trail for a second term. Reagan was only in office for 69 days. Huey Long, George Wallace, and Robert Kennedy likewise were on the campaign trail. So the timing of the murders is a clue as to who and why they do it. Who would take over if President Pierce had also been killed in the derailment? The vice president and a homosexual lover of a homosexual President James Buchanan, whose name was William R. King, was next in line to be president. Both King and Buchanan were easy targets for compromise. They knew they would be exposed or even killed, and the killers would walk free. The untouchables and a broken justice system are in play here. Conclusion: the timing of a president's death is a signal of an assassination. As JFK and other presidents demonstrate, it is easy for a determined president to take away the bank gangsters' power and take away their control of the nation's credit by just the flick of the pen. In the case of President Pierce, they intended to murder the entire First Family. This was not just an attack on the president, but an attack on the nation, its people, our form of government, and everything we believe in. So, why do I firmly believe it was no train accident that took the life of 11-year-old Benny Franklin? It was called a freak railroad accident, and indeed it was. Young Benny was very excited about the train ride and did not stay with his parents, but ran about the train playing and discovering things. He was not with his parents at the time of the derailment. Of the locomotive, the baggage car, and the president's coach, the locomotive and baggage car did not leave the tracks. The president's coach unexpectedly snapped an axle, rolled tumbling down an embankment, and broke in half. The youngster was found with his throat deeply cut and almost decapitated. This was imputed to the train derailment, but it seems an unusually deadly injury for a train wreck. The president and the first lady were not injured. This occurred on January 16, 1853 in Andover, Massachusetts. The Boston and Maine Noon Express, traveling from Boston to Lawrence, Massachusetts, was traveling at 40 miles per hour when the axle broke, throwing the president's coach down the incline. The Boston and Maine Railroad, that is B&M, was a former U.S. Class I railroad in northern New England. It began in 1835. It would seem to take some special military skill and knowledge of trains to have only the axle of the president's car to break at just the right moment to hurl it off the track and down the cliff, while nothing else left the track. The engine, locomotive, the baggage car stayed on the track. Further, someone must have been in place stalking the boy. They murdered him and waited for the derailment to dump the body. This was executed with professional, precise timing and the skill and planning not to be seen in the act of murder.
President Pierce was not able to hide the gruesome sight from Jane. They both suffered severe depression afterward, which likely affected Pierce's performance as president. Jane wondered if the train accident was divine punishment for her husband's pursuit and acceptance of high office. She wrote a lengthy letter of apology to Benny for her failings as a mother. Jane would avoid social functions for much of her first 2 years as First Lady. This quote from the encyclopedia.
First Lady Jane Franklin's intuition was correct, but her logic was not. The murder of her son was punishment for her husband's pursuit and acceptance of the presidency, but not the punishment from her Christian God. Yes, she was right. Her intuition was right on. But the boy's death was at the hands of a bloodthirsty and ruthless and extremely sinister Luciferian banking cartel who selected their young victim because his dad was the President of the United States. So they had targeted this president for assassination because he was opposing the bankers' agenda. He wanted to stop them from dividing up the nation into North and South and having a war and reestablishing their control over the credit of the nation. He was opposing that. He was the kind of person who would oppose that. So they tried to kill him in this railroad accident, kill him, his wife, and his child. But in this case, somehow only the child died. So this president, Franklin Pierce, was one who was a danger to their agenda. They would later also murder President Calvin Coolidge's son for a similar reason, that is, to compromise the president. Coolidge had 2 sons, one was murdered. You might consider, if you believe that the Warren Commission report of the assassination of JFK is phony and full of holes, then what may at first seem like an extreme claim made in this video series, a claim that more than 20 presidents met a similar fate, is in fact an incredible truth.
In the story, The Man with the Twisted Lip, Sherlock Holmes said, quote, "I confess that I have been blind as a mole, but it is better to learn wisdom late than never to learn it at all."
Pierce actively campaigned in his district on behalf of Jackson, who carried both the district and the nation by large margins, in the November 1828 election. Quote from the encyclopedia.
So we have a president, President Pierce now, who was active. He was the Speaker of the House during the administration of President Andrew Jackson. And so they definitely would not want another Andrew Jackson in the White House. So this president became a target because of that. Can you see how when presidents oppose their agenda of controlling the credit and taking over the nation's credit and conquering the nation by taking over its money system and its credit, that when a president opposes them, they kill the president? In this case, the president was compromised by the murder of his son and almost the death of he and his wife. So he also feared for his life. Not only did they kill his son, but he feared for his life. They certainly didn't want another Andrew Jackson type person in the White House. So he was a target.
By 1831 the Democrats held a legislative majority, and Pierce was elected Speaker of the House. The young speaker used his platform to oppose the expansion of banking, protect the state militia, and offer support to the National Democrats and President Andrew Jackson's re-election effort. At the age of 27, he was a star of the New Hampshire Democratic Party.
This encyclopedia quote tells us that Mr. Pierce, who later became president, at the time of Andrew Jackson was the Speaker of the House, a very important position and a very high position in the Democratic Party.
Jackson's second term was underway, and the House had a strong Democratic majority, whose primary focus was to prevent the Second Bank of the United States from being rechartered. The Democrats, including Pierce, defeated proposals supported by the newly formed Whig Party, and the bank's charter expired. Repeat, the bank's charter expired.
And this quote from the encyclopedia tells us that the Democrats were opposing the Whigs, and the Whigs were trying to get the Second Bank of the United States rechartered. Its charter was due to expire. So under the direction of the Democratic Party, in which Pierce played a heavy role, the bank charter expired. And that was the end of that bank. Now, how did they get that bank? That's very interesting, because the first bank was created by Alexander Hamilton. They would falsely tell you that it's a central bank of issue, but it's not. It was not, because it didn't issue paper money that was the obligation of the people. It used gold and silver coins, and everything Hamilton did, he did according to what he was instructed to do by Congress and the Constitution. So the first bank of the United States that lasted 20 years was a successful bank. However, they wanted this bank, when it expired, they wanted the second bank of the United States, and that was to be a central bank of issue which the robber barons would control and therefore conquer your nation. Well, what they did is they had the War of 1812. They came over here with their British troops, burned the White House. President Madison had to flee, otherwise he would have been killed. So this was a very significant event. President Madison was then compromised and undermined, and he signed over and allowed them to have their second bank of the United States, which Andrew Jackson and several other presidents following greatly opposed.
As abolitionism grew more vocal in the mid-1830s, Congress was inundated with petitions from anti-slavery groups seeking legislative action to restrict slavery in the United States. From the beginning, Pierce found the abolitionists' agitation to be an annoyance, and saw federal action against slavery as an infringement on Southern states' rights, even though he was morally opposed to slavery itself. He was also frustrated with the religious bigotry of abolitionists, who classed their political opponents as sinners. Pierce said, quote, "I consider slavery a social and political evil and most sincerely wish that it had no existence upon the face of the earth." End quote. Still, he wrote in December 1835, quote, "One thing must be perfectly apparent to every intelligent man. This abolition movement must be crushed, or there is an end to the Union."
I think President Pierce was a very reasonable person. Why do I think so? Well, he really very, very strongly opposed slavery. He thought it was an abomination. He wanted it rid of. He didn't want it around. But he didn't want it used as an issue to divide up the nation. The abolitionists never proposed a way that this could be done in the Southern society. Just to end it without any plan, because it was immoral. You couldn't just stop an institution like slavery like that. You had to go in some form of step-by-step. And so President Pierce was very reasonable here. He's saying, let's don't have alarmists and screaming and hollering back and forth, north against the south, and dividing up the country, called sectarianism. We don't want that, no. But we will try to work against slavery in some reasonable way. Turns out that he's a president who's against the abolitionists. Not that he was against the idea of ending slavery. It was that they were agitating in a moral framework and getting people of the North and South divided on the issue and dividing up the nation over the slavery issue. On one side, you had people who said, well, slavery is immoral, let's get rid of it. And on the other side, you had the people of the South who were saying, well, we can't just end it suddenly. We'll be in grave danger. We don't know any other way to live.
Pierce voted the party line on most issues. He was an able senator, but not an eminent one. He was overshadowed by the great triumvirate of Calhoun, Henry Clay, and Daniel Webster, who dominated the Senate. Pierce entered the Senate at a time of economic crises, as the Panic of 1837 had begun. He considered the Depression a result of the banking system's rapid growth, amidst the extravagance of overtrading and the wilderness of speculation. So that federal money would not support speculative bank loans, he supported newly elected Democratic President Martin Van Buren in his plan to create an independent treasury, a proposal which split the Democratic Party. Quote from the Encyclopedia.
Pierce charged Treasury Secretary James Guthrie with reforming the Treasury, which was inefficiently managed, with many unsettled accounts. Guthrie increased oversight of Treasury employees and tariff collectors, many of whom were withholding money from the government. Despite laws requiring funds to be held in the Treasury, large deposits remained in private banks under the Whig administrations. Guthrie reclaimed these funds, and sought to prosecute corrupt officials, with mixed success.
So President Jackson killed the second bank of the United States. It had been brought in under the War of 1812 when they burned Washington, D.C. and compromised President Madison. And so Madison approved that, and they started the second bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson wanted to kill it. Well, he killed it by not depositing any more United States money into this private banking system. But he didn't withdraw what was already there. So why was Pierce targeted? Because President Pierce told his Secretary of Treasury to withdraw all of America's money out of the Rothschild Bank. So that would make him a definite target. And that's why they tried to kill him, his wife, and his child in a train derailment, but they only killed the child, probably because he was stalked.
President Pierce never lost sight of politics during his travels, commenting regularly on the nation's growing sectarian conflict. He insisted that Northern abolitionists stand down to avoid a Southern secession, writing that the bloodshed of a civil war would, quote, not be along Mason and Dixon's line merely, but within our own borders in our own streets. He also criticized New England Protestant ministers, who largely supported abolition, and Republican candidates, for their heresy and treason.
So as President Pierce traveled around the country and talked to people, he talked to them about don't let slavery divide our nation. Okay, let's deal with slavery. That's one issue, but let's don't have it divide the nation, and let's don't have a war over it, and let's don't have states secede from the Union and ruin our freedom and Constitution by seceding. Let's don't do that. Because he said this war, and he was right about it, this war is not just going to be at the borders between the North and the Southern states. You got the Gettysburg battle. You have all these battles in the South, Bull Run and all those battles. They were fought in people's backyards, not just on the borders. And so President Pierce was right. He was warning us, but we had 500,000 Americans, mostly white, who died to end slavery and free the blacks.
In the months between Lincoln's election and his inauguration on the 4th of March, 1861, ex-President Pierce looked on as several southern states began plans to secede. He was asked by Justice Campbell to travel to Alabama and address that state's secession convention. Due to illness he declined, but sent a letter appealing to the people of Alabama to remain in the Union, and give the North time to repeal laws against Southern interests and to find common ground.
Well, here even President Pierce is going out of his way to prevent secession. Now the Confederate government, fully in the hands of Judah Benjamin, who owned the Treasury and his private account in London, and was a dictator of the South, he wanted a war, and he wanted to divide up the nation, and he wanted the states to secede from the Union. So when he traveled about, President Pierce was opposing the secession of the states. He wanted the states to stay in the Union. That made him a target for the globalists. When half the states leave the Union, then you really don't have either in the North or the South the original constitutional government. What Lincoln had to do was reestablish the constitutional government because it had been broken in half. Half the states had left. This is a problem that many people have. They think that the South just withdrew and that didn't affect the Constitution or the freedom of people, but it did. It affected, when the South withdrew, it affected everybody. It broke the nation. It broke the Union.
Pierce wanted to avoid war at all costs, and wrote to President Van Buren, proposing an assembly of former U.S. presidents to resolve the issue, but this suggestion was not acted on. I will never justify, sustain or in any way or to any extent uphold this cruel, heartless, aimless, unnecessary war, Pierce wrote to his wife in the letter.
Banks lend by creating credit. They create the means of payment out of nothing. Repeat, out of nothing, out of nothing, out of nothing, stated Ralph M. Hawtrey, Secretary of the British Treasury. And finally, this gem from the Sherlock Holmes story, The Final Problem. I think that you know me well enough, Watson, to understand that I am by no means a nervous man. At the same time, it is stupidity rather than courage to refuse to recognize danger when it is close upon you.
So here, a high authority in the banking system is telling us that they create money out of nothing. So how does this work? I mean, you guys that are watching this video, you have to get a job and you get a salary and then you can pay your bills. You have to work. You get the money and then you can buy things with it. Well, they're saying here that the bankers create loans out of nothing. They get the money for nothing they loan. Now, how does that work? Well, it's because of the banking system. When they make a loan, say to you, you go out and work and pay and sell stuff or manufacture stuff or whatever people do to earn money. When you earn that money, you pay it back. But when the loan started, it wasn't anything but an entry in a bookkeeping entry or a computer entry. It was nothing. It had no value. But by working and paying it back, you are giving it value. Well, if the whole system works this way, then the loans in the past are guaranteeing, in a way, the loans in the future, and so then that makes it keeps refeeding itself. Loans are made that are nothing, loans are paid back that are something, loans that are nothing are made, then loans that are something are paid back. So that's the way the system is worked. It's hard for a person who works on a daily basis to get his salary to understand that these robber barons are able to just create money out of nothing by just typing it in the computer and then loaning it to people. Not a good system. It's a way you lose your freedom. They buy up everything. What the conclusion is of this video is that Franklin Pierce's son was murdered in order to undermine his presidency and to take over and control the credit of the United States. And also, they were working very hard to create a war between the North and the South. What we need to understand, it's our obligation being born in a free country and want to be free, want to elect our representatives and so on, is that we should look into the Mayflower Compact, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. We should understand the Declaration of Independence. We should understand the Constitution, and we should study and understand the Bill of Rights. That should be enough to make us free, but it's not. Because the robber barons of 17th and 18th century have been attacking this form of freedom because they want to rule by an aristocracy. They want a small number of people to rule over the rest. And so they have constantly attacked that. Our founding fathers, George Washington, was fighting the same thing at his time that we are fighting now. And you know what? It's just a trick. It's an easy trick. The trick they know is if they control the volume of money in circulation, they can conquer the nation. So Sherlock Holmes tells us, well, hey, when a danger is close upon you, it's stupidity not to take some kind of action. Now, what action could you take? So we need to understand the banking system. They say that most people, Rothschilds told us, most people don't understand it, and they benefit from it, so they'll just keep it going, and that will destroy everybody's freedom. So this is very, very important, that not only do we understand how to vote and what the issues are and that sort of thing, that we understand how the control of the credit of the United States is a grave danger to the people of the nation, of any free nation in the world, when that credit is controlled by a small group of insane people. And that's what the banking cartel really is. They have bloodline insanity.